Transitions include moments when there is a shift in what holds value and meaning to us. And they require us to re-examine our assumptions about our identity, our capacity, and our values.
Welcome to the Midlife Reinvention podcast. I'm your host, Kavita, and the founder of Power Purpose Play, a global community of women in midlife. I'm here to tell you that it's your time now to rediscover what has always been inside of you and bring that out into the world. If you're wondering what's next, but don't know quite what that is, or if you feel a twinge in your heart telling you that you have so much more to do and so much more to offer, you're in the right place. Ask yourself, if not now, when? Do you want to leave your job, start your own business, take control of your health, reignite the passion in your marriage, write that book, or at least that first chapter? Transitions like this can be daunting, but through listening to my story and interviews with incredible women every week, I hope to inspire you to take action. I rediscovered myself after the age of 50, and I know you can too. It's my time now to help you do just that. I'm so excited you're here. Let's dive in. I am so excited you are all in for a huge treat today. I am so thrilled to have on our podcast today someone who I know that you will not only be inspired by because of her own story of transition, but also someone who you're really going to learn so much from because of how she explains somewhat difficult concepts in a way that we can all really truly understand and apply directly into our lives. So I'm super pleased to speak with Linda Rossetti today.
Kavita, nice to be here.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to let everybody know about your impressive and amazing background before I start asking you some questions, if you don't mind. So Linda has, as I said, an incredibly impressive background. She is a Harvard MBA, a serial entrepreneur, and an expert on transition, and especially on its impact on individuals and organizations. And Linda's work focuses on establishing a new context for understanding transitions and introducing tools and techniques to navigate transition successfully. So I believe, Linda, your commitment to your work is rooted in a lot of research and decades of executive leadership roles as well as your own personal experience with transition. So I'm so pleased and honored actually to have you here today. So welcome.
Kavita, thank you so much. And I'm thrilled to be here.
That's wonderful. So, I have to tell you, Linda, that when I first saw the title of your book, The Women in Transition, Reinventing Work and Life, which is an Amazon top seller, by the way, I was really obviously immediately drawn to you because that is really the focus of the podcast and the focus of Power Purpose Play. And there was a quote that I'd like to read for the audience that really particularly drew me in. And that was, and I'll read it to you, transition is an incredible invitation to unlock the enormous potential that is resident within each of us. Yeah. And, that resonates so much with me because that's really what the whole point of this podcast, it's really about gaining what's always been inside of you. So I want to just point that out. And I also like to just kind of, I guess, begin at the beginning and ask you, what is transition? And, in your book, you also say it's a normal stage of adult growth and development, but it's not widely understood. So maybe you can get into what it is and why do we need to change the way the world thinks about transitions?
Well, Kavita, you've given us a lot to start with, so thank you. And yes, you found this opportunity set that I have kind of come upon that I think is so rich and quite honestly misunderstood. And really that's where my work centers, is really acting as an advocate or educator to try to help people rethink moments in our life when our identity gets disrupted, right? It can be when, we've unexpectedly lost a job, or if we have a spouse who asks for a divorce, or perhaps we've come out of a very scary health crisis and we're fine, or we're standing in the supermarket checkout line and all of a sudden we just have this feeling in the pit of our stomach like, oh no, right? It can come in all these ways, but I find that these moments very often challenge our thinking about who we are and how we make meaning in the world. And it is those moments that have been so fascinating to me over the last decade, right? Because I think I went through kind of this wrenching time where all of that all of a sudden became disrupted or disorganized, and I didn't know what to do with it. I had no vocabulary on how to respond. And the most fascinating thing along all of that was that the people around me didn't have any idea how to respond, right? And many of them kind of looked at me like, what's the matter with you? Like, get over it, like, move on. And I was like, wait a minute. No, this is real. And I think maybe because of how awful I was feeling and because of their reaction, I was like, wait a minute. I can't be the first one to have been going through this. And that turned me to what has now been a decade of research about investigating these moments when, for whatever reason, good reason, bad reason, unexpected, planned, who knows, right? Any reason, we land at these moments where there's a shift in how we've come to think about ourselves. And from that research, frankly, I was astonished by what I learned, because I learned that we as a society really misunderstand those moments. And as a result, we stall, we retreat, we disengage instead of really using those moments as a launching pad for opportunities to access kind of more and more of who we are and the potential that's resident within us. And so I talk about those moments as transitions, as choices. And again, I think, for your listeners, sometimes those moments are enormous, right? They're all of who we are. And other times they're pieces of who we are, right? It's our spirituality or a special relationship or the way we work. And those questions about who we are begin an inquiry that's very important that I, again, think too few of us take advantage of. So let me pause there, Kavita, and see if I at least gave a smidge of the answer you were hoping for.
It completely does. And I think it's those moments of really choice that's what came out from one of the things that came out from what you said. And it's really the choice as to what you want to do with those moments that come your way. I wanted to kind of ask you, when women in our community, people who may be listening to this podcast, they will say that, especially in midlife, at this stage in life, that it's too difficult to change, right? For a number of reasons. And then as I was reading your book, they are actually right, because change is difficult, right? But you say that change is not the same thing as transition. And so can you kind of explain that? And maybe, based on what you said before, maybe you can elaborate on why you say that change and transition are different.
Sure. A lot of this thinking about what is change and what is transition came out of my research, right? And I found that as I spoke with people, we interchange vocabulary around these big moments to beat the band, right? We use the word transition to mean everything from, Caitlyn Jenner's kind of transformation to what happens in households, across the world when kids go back to school, right? So transition has this very broad set of usages. So the beginning part of my work was really just to try to isolate, well, what do we mean? When we say transition, what do we really mean? And what that brought me to was a very stark difference between the word change and the word transition when it includes topics that are part of our self-definition, right? So what I found is that changes are used to reach a goal, right? They're very often about known outcomes, right? So I have a job, for whatever reason, it's not going well, or maybe I was let go and I need another job. I need to replace income. I need to work. I mentally need to work, whatever it is. And we would pursue a change then, right? It's a known outcome. I need another job. That's very different from what I understood transition to be, because what I learned about transition is transitions include moments when there is a shift in what holds value and meaning to us, right? And they require us to re-examine our assumptions about our identity, our capacity, and our values, right? So I'll say that again, because that's a lot, right?
Yes.
So that changes are very goal-oriented, right? We have a known outcome that we can, while we might not know the specifics, right? Yes, I need a new job. Will it be at Google or will it be at, UBS? Who knows, right? Transitions are very different. it's an unknown outcome, right? We're stepping into a process that has an unclear outcome. But what's required of us in transition is that we honor the shifts that are occurring in how we make meaning in the world. And the definition I use for transition is it is a process that requires us to re-examine our assumptions about our identity, our capacity, and our values. Mm-hmm. And I find with that vocabulary, women and men, right? Because by the way, transition is not gendered. Even though my book was called Women and Transition, transition itself isn't gendered. My initial assumptions were that women, because of the broad roles we play in society, are given these invitations to transition more often than men, right? Mm-hmm. That was my going in assumption. Mm-hmm. And so this notion of transition, it's really about the assumptions that we use to define ourselves. So, by the way, we can go through hundreds of changes in our lives and never transition. Mm-hmm. Or we can go through one moment and decide to transition, right? So the notion that changes are about outcomes that are known and transitions about our exploring or re-exploring our assumptions make it so that, to your earlier point, we can be going through a change and do some things related to transition. Right? You know, it may be that the most beautiful thing, I should say, that I think about transition is that in our mind's eye, right, the movie screen version of what life is supposed to be, we think transition are these enormous departures. We go from point A to point B, and it's this huge one swing of the bat, off we go, we're running the bases, we're going to get there. And what I've learned is that transitions are very, very different. Mm-hmm. Really, when we think about the assumptions about who we are and how we make meaning in the world, it has to do with connecting with our voice and our willingness to let others see who we are. Not the expectations that are out there about what we should or could do, but who we are. Mm-hmm. And by the way, that can happen without departing anything, right? You can stay in your current job and just choose to bring more of who you are to that moment. Mm-hmm. It may, by the way, it may lead to departures, right? But it isn't required to, because I find that the common denominator for transition is us. It's ourselves and our willingness to begin to lead in more honest and authentic ways with who we are. And although I get like little scary lights when I say that word authentic, because I think it means a lot of things to different people, but what I'm really talking about is our willingness to share who we are mm-hmm. with the situations we find ourselves. That's really what transition is all about.
That resonates so much with me because I experienced this in my own life. I felt like something was shifting, around the time I turned 50, and it was inside of me, and I didn't know what it was really. And it generally was, I wasn't satisfied in my current career and my job, right? So I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll just change jobs, maybe that'll fix everything. But in fact, that wasn't the case. So that's the change you're talking about. But the transition I went through was really trying to understand my values, how they had changed and what they meant to me and what was I going to do with that moving forward. Is that kind of what you're...
Perfect. Yes, okay. You've got it. And I have to say there is some wonderful research out there that says we use change to avoid transition.
Absolutely.
Right.
That,
and I'm the one that used that as well. Right. When I had this like moment in my life where in a very short period of time, I had my second child, I lost my dad to cancer, and I changed jobs. And it was this crazy, crazy moment. And I realized then that I probably was at the beginning parts of a transition, mm-hmm. but I chose change to quite quell the upset that was going on, right? I switched jobs. I'm like, oh, it must be the job. Job's wrong. I gotta get a different job. And what ultimately happened is I worked and worked and worked at that new job. And I did it to a point where I was completely depleted. I had nothing more to give. And that brought me to a moment where I remember I was sitting in my boss's staff meeting. And at the time, I had, the job that many would dream of. I was an executive, direct report to a CEO of a Fortune 500 global company, right? I had enormous worldwide responsibility. And I'll never forget sitting in that staff meeting and saying to myself, this is it? You have got to be kidding me. I've worked this hard for this? And, we were spending it was one of these all day long meetings, the agenda packed from 8 a.m. to 6, all these, really vivid issues that were happening across the world in this business. And here I'm sitting there saying, you have got to be kidding me. This is it. Mm-hmm. And so, it took a lot to trust that instinct. And I think that I had, for many years, deferred to change, trying to quiet what was a growing recognition inside that said, there's something not right here. Mm-hmm. And it really took me going to almost the breaking point, right? And I was saying, I had 2 kids, under 5. I was doing laps around the planet on airplanes. It was horrendous in terms of a schedule. Mm-hmm. And when I say it almost took me to breaking point, it was because, that moment when I sat in my boss's staff meeting, I had very little more to give. And right. I want to be clear. Our circumstances are very different, right? Everyone brings something different. I'm not saying this is only for people who sit in the C-suite. The reality is I spent years talking with almost 300 people about their experiences in transition. And from that, I can tell you that it's irrelevant what our circumstances are. This opportunity to get to a moment where our identity in some way gets disrupted and we can choose then has nothing to do with whether that was triggered by a personal relationship, a professional situation, a spirituality, a health, a financial situation. It can be anything. And so the circumstances differ. But what is common to all transitions is that we have the courage to ask questions about who we are. And we're willing to entertain what the answers might be. And that sounds so simple, but it is terrifying in our world.
Simple, no.
Right? It is, right? Yeah. Think of the neighbor who tells you over the fence, oh yeah, I left my job. Right? We're wired to say, oh my goodness, what's wrong?
Right.
Did she fail? Right. Right. And I'm just saying that we are so conditioned by society to process these moments in ways that misrepresent what they are. Yeah. Because what they are incredible invitations to grow.
I was going to ask you to tell me about your story, and you did. So that's awesome. But I wanted to go back a little bit because you said that you went through these changes, like you decided to do another job and pursue that because, that's what you were expected or whatever. But what actually what was that trigger in your life that actually triggered the transition to you deciding to do this research? I mean, you said it took a while to make that transition. And I know that in your book, you do talk about the anatomy of a transition. So the 3 parts of that is, the first one is a trigger, the second being the decision, and then the third, the action. So what was it that triggered your transition?
Right. So the triggers, I use the word trigger in the book as the catalyst, right? The thing that deposits us at this moment saying, oh my goodness, there really is something that I need to address. And I think for me, I ignored a ton of triggers, right? It's like, oh, I'm too busy. I can't do that. I just put my head down and keep working. And I think that, the catalysts, I use the word catalyst a lot in my work. And for me, those catalysts are things that deposit us at this recognition that something needs to be addressed. Mm-hmm. And for me, the catalyst happened, well, there were lots of them. And frankly, I ignored most of them. But one of them that was really very important happened when I was on a business trip in London. I had a daughter at the time who was in kindergarten, and something happened in the pickup. We had Mary Poppins as a nanny for many years. And I feel so fortunate because I know, look, childcare is an extraordinary barrier. And hopefully we'll talk about barriers soon.
Yes.
But, it's an extraordinary issue that I was fortunate enough to be able to navigate my way through. At any rate, we had a drama. And my daughter was fine, by the way. Mm-hmm. But I got a phone call, to kind of alert me as to what was happening back in the States. Here I am, more than 3,000 miles across an ocean away. And, my husband says she's fine. And it was like in that moment as if somebody pushed me through to another reality, right? I now have a teenage son. who
Yes.
watches all these dystopian films, and these people like go into alternate universes.
Yes.
And it was as if like right there, standing
Right.
on the banks of the Thames River, I was pushed out.
Oh, no.
And I was just like, oh my goodness, what's happening? And I think that finally like shocked me into saying, Linda, you can't ignore this anymore, right? And it wasn't about parenting. It wasn't about the job. And it wasn't about 1,000 other things that I could point to. There was something that I could not name at that time. I now can name it. It was a beginning of a transition, but I couldn't name it. And it was troubling, and I was afraid, and I just didn't have any vocabulary or way to address it. And I found that very isolating.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I'm somebody who has spent my adult life in a sea of people, right? I'm constantly with people. And yet at that time, even when I was with other people, I was alone in a very new way. And again, these emotions and what was happening at the time drew me into saying, wait a minute, there's got to be another way to think about this. And that's what really started my research that led me to be able to say to you, Kavita, that yes, there are these opportunities in life that arrive, and they usually arrive by triggers. And those triggers can be 1,000 things. Like I said at the beginning of our call, they can be, a spouse who says, hey, I'm out of here. I want a different relationship. Or it can be, we're standing in the supermarket checkout line and we realize like, wait a minute, like we're sick to our stomach. We don't know what's going on, right? So it can arrive in 1,000 different ways. But what that all of a sudden usually is telling us is it's signaling us that we have an opportunity to make a choice. And I've learned that transitions, right? The decision is, will we make that choice? And if we do, we pivot to some very specific actions that help us re-examine who we are and how we make meaning in the world.
Wow, that must have been quite experience when you just all of a sudden, it's like the ground fell from underneath you, right? And I think what you just said will resonate so much with our listeners because, I think this leads into my next topic or question is that, many of us experience these triggers, whether it's like you said, divorce or job loss or a death in the family or whatever the trigger might be. But we take too long or we decide not to take action. And sometimes we never do, and I think that leads into the fact that there's all these obstacles in our way, right? And some women or some people just don't take the action because of these obstacles. And you talk about in your book, Linda, these various transitions, and you speak of 4 types. And I think it would be useful for you to go through those because I think people can resonate with that, and also maybe what are there's a lot of ways I'm sure you can get over these, these obstacles or these barriers, but maybe a couple of ways that you would recommend or that you've seen in your research how people get through these obstacles.
Sure. And I do want to say that barriers are such a common occurrence in our experience of the triggers and all the way through the anatomy, right? Our experience of the triggers, our processing of the choices we want to make, and in our work when we choose to transition, right? So barriers can play a kind of an accompanying role throughout the whole experience. And what I've learned is that, first of all, I talk about barriers as anything that impedes our progress in a desired direction, right? I'll say that again. A barrier is anything that impedes our progress in a desired direction, right? And it can be an emotion, right? Our emotions can be barriers, right? Think about the last time that you had a disruption of some sort in your identity. It's, I've named a lot of the emotions so far, but it can be terrifying and sad and regretful, and people can feel listless and sometimes there's glimmers of hope, but a lot of times it's anxiety and real fear, right? So the emotions can serve as barriers, right? But so can other things, like physical things, like, okay, the mortgage payment or time, right? We have, 8,000 things to do every day, time can be a barrier. And so when I started my research, I thought, as the diligent, good student, as many women are, that I would list all the barriers and be able to hand my, my readers, the keys, like, here's the answer to the barriers. And what I learned was something very different. And that is that barriers never go away. right? We never get to kind of a barrier-free zone, right? We don't wake up one day and say, oh, all done. I finished. Now I can go on, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I learned is that we need to learn how to be different in the presence of barriers, right? Because if we can change our relationship to the barriers, right, we can learn to be successful in light of the barriers, regardless of what they are. You know, they can be huge brick walls in front of us, and we can still be successful in, you know, letting who we are and what we care about really define the day. And so, you know, barriers, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about, you know, how we would address barriers. But, you know, again, I think that I remember there was one woman who came in, and she was fantastic. She was somebody who was going through a separation from her spouse, and they had 4 children, and she had worked for many years, but when her 3rd or 4th child was born, she decided to stay home full time.
Right.
And as the separation process initiated, she had to get back to work. And she said, you know, I'm trying, and I'm getting kind of these interviews, and I'm not getting any follow-up interviews. You know, people, you know, talk to me, and they won't like have me back. And she was in a crisis because she had incredible financial pressure. And she realized through the process and the work that we did together was that the way she told her story itself was a barrier, right? So barriers can be enormous. They can be physical things like a mortgage payment or a vehicle that stops working and you're on the side of the road trying to get to an interview. They can be our emotions, but they can also be the way we voice our story. And so barriers are very worthy. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about how to navigate barriers because, you know, I'll say again, from my research, I've learned that we never get to this kind of Valhalla place with barriers, meaning we're at a barrier-free zone. What we need to do is learn to be different in the face of barriers because we can be very successful even with barriers all around us.
That's some great tips. You know, in our community, we often talk about these barriers that stop us. And a lot of them are, firstly, it could be the negative self-talk that we have within ourselves. And then also societal expectations, you know, what are people going to think if I do A, B, and C, you know? And I think especially as women in midlife, you know, we've played so many different roles in our life. And do you think that, you know, having to adhere to those roles as we get older, it also is a barrier, right? We can't get out of those roles. You know, they're so ingrained in us that it's difficult for us to move past those.
You know, it's so interesting you say that because one of the most active pieces of work I do with groups or with individuals is this notion of recognizing the expectations that currently shape who we are.
Right.
And very often what's happening in transition is that we not only need to honor those expectations, we need to reorder them and maybe even let some go. And that is a very, very difficult process, right? You know, we imagine if your listeners would allow us, right? You know, think for a minute about an expectation you have for yourself, you know, to be a good parent or be a certain member of the community. And then ask yourself for a minute, okay, where does that expectation come from? Is it from my family? Is it from my extended family? Is it from my occupation? Is it from the schools I've gone to? Is it from my religious affiliations? Like, where is it from? Can you name it? And then ask yourself about whether it's firmly in place or if it might be in flux. And that kind of a cycle is the beginning of really trying to recognize that forward, right, in choosing transition, maybe realigning, maybe letting go of, or reprioritizing expectations, right? Because a lot of the negative judgment that we encounter as we're transitioning has to do with our evaluation of ourself against an expectation, right? So a lot of times people say, oh, the right thing to do here is every time you feel sad, feel kindness, right? Like we try to rewire the response. And I've learned in my research that that's called an emotional bypass when we try to say, oh, when you feel anxiety, go to kindness or gratefulness. I'm not suggesting that both of those aren't valid and very honorable things to kind of hold and to be with.
Right.
But what that's doing is it's addressing the emotional response, and it isn't talking about the expectations. And so what I find in the work, when somebody says, you know what, it's clear I'm in transition, I want to start to process this. Not only does the book give you new ways to be with emotions and think about that, it also talks about the expectations, right? Because we can't just assume that, okay, we're going to be different and those expectations are going to stay rock solid. Because what transitioning is asking us to do is re-examine those expectations and maybe alter them a little bit. Because in that, all of a sudden, the emotional connection changes.
Right. Wow, that's a lot. Okay. That's interesting. I wanted to thank you for that. I wanted
For sure.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, and that you said that transition is not gender specific. And along the same lines, would you say that is more difficult for women to transition in their later years, like in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, versus maybe in their younger years? And if so, why or why not? Have you found in your research there's a difference?
So is it age related? Is that okay summary for what your question is?
Yes.
And so I should say, when I went in to the research, I had some serious assumptions, right? I said, absolutely, it's gendered. And I thought particularly as the roles that women hold, which in my mind get more and more complex as we age because we have children and adult children and other care relationships in our orbit. I said, oh, it has to even accelerate then in terms of its complexity as we age. And what the research told me was that I was wrong on both counts. That doesn't mean there aren't important things we have to listen to as women, right? The first is gender is completely disconnected from age. Anyone at any age can transition, right? In my 50s. So in the 1970s, there was a very famous worldwide book called Passages. It was written by a woman called Gail Sheehy, an American.
Yes.
And she said, our lives go through predictable patterns. In our 20s, certain things happen. In our 30s, certain things happen, and so on by the decade. And what researchers have done since then is basically debunked that connection between circumstances and age, right? So at any age, you can transition. And I think what I learned from the research is that what differs is women's conditioning, right? Women are conditioned to behave in a certain way in our society. And that transition in and of itself is a common set of processes, right? By the way, we go through the same type of transition if what brings us to transition is divorce or what brings us to transition is the birth of another child, right?
Right.
Either of those catalysts bring us to transition, and we use the same process to go through transition, right? But how we arrive is really shaped by how we're conditioned. And that has to do with, where and how we form our identity. And when we all enter adulthood, the vast majority of us enter adulthood at a time when we draw our definition and expectation for who we are from our external community.
Right.
That can be the schools we attend. That can be the families where we grew up. It can be the occupation we choose, but it also includes the context that society establishes for women, right? So what are we supposed to be and do, right? So all of that kind of arrives with us, as we have a set of expectations. And so that's where I think transitioning becomes gendered, because if what transition is doing is we're decoupling from some of those expectations and we're moving them, we're rerouting them on some expectations that are very internally or personally stated, we're having to decouple or rethink about those external expectations that are very societal. And in my book, I go through an awful lot of the expressions of those, right? Voice being one of them, right? How society teaches women's voices to be, and how women, there's a lot of tremendous research, again, that I reference in the book about, women are kind of socialized to favor relationships, over their own needs, and that will silence our voices and who we are in favor of maintaining and cultivating relationships. I'm not judging that. I'm not saying that's right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But when we transition, we need to recognize that that's here, right? It's walking with us.
Right.
And that shapes our experience of transitioning, right? So transitioning itself isn't gendered. It's not age related, but how we're socialized is very much a part of how we transition.
Hmm. That's interesting. I thought it would be age related because, I think as we grow older, we probably are looking at ahead and what have we done? We haven't done enough. We want to do so much more. And so it's like, then you start questioning yourself and what you have accomplished and what more you need to do more than perhaps when you're younger and you're busy with life more than perhaps when you're older. So that's an interesting outcome of your research.
I think one of the other things to keep in mind, Kavita, is that because of all that you just described,
Mm-hmm.
I think that managing the emotions, particularly the fear, like many people are afraid of the consequences. They have too much to lose, right? That the emotional processing of transition, I think, becomes that much more activated when
Mm-hmm.
we're older, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're older. For many, right? Because, a lot of people are very fearful that they'll make a wrong choice and that will have implications on their ability to be safe, to have, security, whether that be financial security or other profiles of security. So I don't want to diminish that for many, the emotional, and again, I talk about this in the book about techniques on how to be with the emotional side of transitioning. It's a very big part of how to move forward at these times. And,
Mm-hmm.
and the great news is the people who do transition, oh my God, they uniformly describe it as enlivening and positive and optimistic and
Right.
an additive to their confidence, regardless of age.
Right.
And I think that, there was this one woman, her name was Margaret, and she had a very long life and divorced late in life and really had to go through some really personally very wrenching experiences. And I remember she talked about transition. I won't get the quote exactly right, but she said something like, transition is scary and I don't want to diminish that because it's really dealing with your expectations and letting go of ones that don't fit. But she said, oh my God, it's so fantastic. What's on the other
What's on
side
the
of
other
this
side?
is just mind blowing. And
Yeah.
so I think that, emotions play a very important role.
Mm-hmm.
And very often emotions mobilize to keep us in place.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So emotions are reading, oh, wait a minute, Kavita looks like she may start moving in different directions. We're going to act like emotional quicksand to hold her.
Right.
And part of the work in transitioning is learning how to rewire that relationship with emotions so that in fact, emotions can be enablers instead of detractors, and get us to this place where, yes, it is incredibly enlivening to transition.
And I can attest to that because once you realize and once you go through that and, I think it's an ongoing process, but I have experienced that and it's amazing because you just wake up and you feel refreshed and you feel like there's so much more purpose and so much more excitement in your life, I wanted to talk a little bit about the process to transitioning. And I know that in your book, you talk about envisioning. And I think that's something that's very important. First you envision, and then you kind of validate that vision that you discuss. And I often find that the biggest barrier for people is just to get started, just to take that first step. And I know that there was an exercise in your book. You talked about if you had to pack a bag on your journey, and if you were going, if you were to envision a journey of transition, what would you pack in the bag? And I thought that was a really cool exercise. But it's kind of around the whole point of visioning and taking that first step. What would you say to people, like, just to take the step? How do they do that, and how do they stop getting stuck?
Hi, my friend. Kavita here. Do you often feel blocked from moving forward? We all feel that way at times. These are referred to as energy blocks. I've created a short, actionable PDF guide to help you release your negative energy blocks. Click the link in the description to download it now for free. Now, Let's get back to the episode.
Yes, and so thank you for asking that question, because I think a lot of people, when they understand what transition represents and the great value, they're like, okay, how do I start?
Yeah.
And then they get very quiet because it's like, oh, that seems big. And I think the probably the most practical and best way I can say to get started is think of the smallest thing you can do, like break it down to the teeniest step and just take that one step, right? And I come from the technology industry. I spent a career in technology, and many of your listeners may be familiar with what's happened in that industry in terms of developing software and tools in the last decades. And what we've done is we've moved from a waterfall approach to development to what is called an agile approach. And the reason why I mention that is it's a very simple shift, and it relates to what I mean about taking a small step, right? Waterfall development used to put these like groups of developers in these huge rooms and say, okay, you work on part A and you work on part B and you work on part C, and work. And then we'll all come together at some day in the future. Let's call it 100 days in the future, and cheer that we've all done our work. And what would happen on day 100 is they would all come back exhausted and say, woohoo. And then they'd realize that A and B and C and D didn't work together, right? And so then they'd have another 300 days to try to redo what they did in the first 100 days to try to make it work together.
Right.
And what Agile did is say, that's crazy. What we really need to do is work incrementally, right? Take the big problem we want to solve and bring it down to really teeny components, work a teeny bit, and then test the together, right? So, okay, we're going to work one day, A, B, C, D, work one day, and then we're going to come back tomorrow morning and figure out what we learned. And then we're going to break and we're going to work one more day, and then we're going to come back and learn what we did.
Right.
And what they found is that while it might take 120 days to get everything done, it didn't take 400, right? And everyone was like, oh, Agile is the smartest way to do anything. And I think that, again, for people who are familiar with the technology world, in reading the book, they'll see that the author is, in fact, somebody who grew up in that shift to Agile, right? And that is when people say, how do I do this, Linda? It is recognizing that there's an opportunity to envision something big and take a small step in the direction of that big, and then take a breath and see what you learned, and then take one more step. And it is really creating this muscle memory of taking a step and a step and a step that gets us to this fantastic place of, where you are, Kavita, which is, I've unlocked this purpose and energy that, frankly, it was cloudy. I didn't see it, or I wasn't connected to it.
Yeah.
And from your smile, I can tell you're there. And you rightly say you're there, but beginning, because it is a process that continues to invite us to connect into more and more. And for those who have the courage and the willingness to do that, the payback is superb.
The first step is to take a step, right?
Right. What was that? A journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step.
Yes.
One step.
And that's so true, because if you think about all the things, you have a big vision, and if you think about all the things, it's so daunting, right? So if you break it down like you suggested, it makes it a little bit easier, and
you get to feedback, even your own feedback, and you get a sense for how it feels to be different, to move in a different way. And those are important signals as we move. And so, I obviously am a big advocate of transitioning, because I think I look at our misunderstanding of transition and say, oh, this is a huge talent leakage for our society, and training people, teaching people about what could possibly be if we trust ourselves and transition, not only has benefit to individuals, but it has a collective benefit. And I think it's really something to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
Particularly at this time, right? When we're embroiled in a global crisis.
Yes.
That just isn't just health, and the health clearly is extraordinary, but it has repercussions for economics and education and well-being, that is really quite extraordinary. So, I look to transition as an accelerator to addressing what we all need to pay attention to.
It's so important, and the discussion is so important. And if you could tell us what are you working on now? Where's your research taking you now? And I understand you're writing a new book.
Yes, so I have so many things up. I would encourage your listeners, if it works out, I think you're going to give them my website. Visit lindarossetti.com. It has a wealth of resources. It has my podcast, which is really exciting. It's called Destination Unknown. And I talk with people who are transitioning, right? And through all of those stories, they're short, they're 10 minutes. You can get a sense for what's happening in the process of transitioning. But I am involved. My second book is nearing completion, which is very exciting. And it has an additional set of research, which really forms the backbone of that book, which is a deeper dive into transition, making sure we understand it and the opportunity. And also I'm involved in additional research in collaboration with universities in the States. And we're looking at how transition is really affecting women, particularly in the COVID era.
Oh,
because in the COVID era is, again, having implications on women's experience in ways that are different from their male colleagues. And so Kavita, thank you for asking. There's a lot on my plate, but, as somebody who's, my role is a thought leader, advocate, change agent on this. There's always research going on here.
Well, you're obviously so passionate about it. And I think the messages that you're trying to impart are so invaluable. And there's so much going on in the world, as you said. And if we can all recognize those opportunities for transition, I think it's going to really make the world a better place, really, if you think about it.
I agree. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Linda, is there any last message or anything final words that you'd like to tell our listeners about, or about the importance of transition, or just anything in general that you'd like to send a message?
Sure, I will. I'll go back to some of the things you started us off with, Kavita, which is, transition is misread a lot in our society, but at its core, it's an opportunity that has resident in it an extraordinary benefit that's available to anyone, regardless of their circumstances. And all it takes is an awareness of what's happening, right? Educate ourselves on it, and then the courage to take just the first step. That's it. And so, I thank you so much for allowing me to speak with you today, and for, allowing me to share my story with your listeners. It's an incredible privilege. And, I couldn't encourage anyone more. If they even have a glimpse of maybe transition is something they'd like to pursue, to listen to that and explore what that might mean.
Absolutely. You have, as I said in my opening, that your story is not only inspiring, but your research and your knowledge on the subject is so important. And I would really encourage anyone who is interested in further understanding Linda's work to please reach out. We'll have all your links in terms of your book and all your other activities going on in our show notes. But I would really encourage anybody who is has that little voice inside of them and wondering what that is, to explore that a little bit. And I think it might be you're on the verge of transition. So, thank you so much, Linda. It was just a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show today.
Likewise. Great to see you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Linda Rossetti. As I'm sure you'll agree, her knowledge and research on the topic of transition is so empowering for all of us, and really an opportunity for us to question what holds value and meaning to us. There's so many important points here, but here are some of her main key takeaways. Number one, we land at moments of transition when there's a shift in how we've come to think about ourselves. We as a society really misunderstand these moments. Number two, we often stall, we retreat and disengage instead of using these moments of transition as a launching pad for opportunities to access more of who we are and the potential that is resident within each of us. Number three, there is a very stark difference between the words change and transition. Changes are very goal-oriented. We have a known outcome. Transitions, however, are when we are stepping into a process that has an unclear outcome. We often use change to avoid transition. Number four, transitions include moments when there's a shift in what holds value and meaning to us. They require us to re-examine our assumptions about our identity, our capacity, and our values. Number five, transitions have to do with connecting with our authentic voice and our willingness to let others see who we are, not the expectation of what we should and could do, but who we are. Number six,
What is common to all of us is that we have the courage to ask questions about who we are, and we are willing to entertain what the answers might be. These moments are incredible invitations to grow. Number 7, a barrier is anything that impedes our progress in a desired direction, such as emotions, money, or time. Barriers never go away. If we change our relationship to the barriers, we can learn to be successful in spite of the barriers. Number 8, choosing transition may be realigning, maybe letting go of, or reprioritizing our expectations. Number 9, people who do transition universally describe it as enlivening and positive and optimistic and additive to their confidence, regardless of age. Number 10, recognize that there is an opportunity to envision something big and take a small step in the direction of that big. Take a breath and see what you learned, and then take one more step. You could be in many places, and I so appreciate you being here to take time for your own growth. I am so enjoying bringing you these important topics every week, and I hope you gain something new from them as well. As always, share, a rating and review is always appreciated, as it really helps us get our message across the world. Remember, take that small step in the direction of something big. And I'll be here again next week.